Okay, today we're going to be looking at Saul Kripke's book, Naming and Necessity. Now, this will just be some excerpts from Naming and Necessity, but Naming and Necessity is considered one of the most significant works of the last 50 or so years in analytic philosophy, and in particular in philosophy of language, but also in a bunch of other areas like metaphysics and philosophy of mind. This book is extremely influential. And uh, the idea is that he's going to take the theory of naming, which goes back to Frege at least. Frege introduces this distinction between the meaning of a name and the thing that the name stands for. And Kripke is going to argue that properly understanding the relationship between the meaning of a name and the thing it stands for will help us better understand what does it mean for a statement to be necessarily true or possibly true, what it is to know something for certain or to be unsure of it, what is it for something to be true in virtue of meaning versus in virtue of facts in the world. And even though he's primarily talking about names, he is going to eventually suggest that this theory will help us understand how other words work in language. And okay, so as you see at the beginning, this is a series of lectures. Lecture 1, January 20, 1970. And as he says in the footnote, in January of 1970, I gave 3 talks at Princeton University, transcribed here. As the style of the transcript makes clear, I gave the talks without a written text, and in fact, without notes. The present text is lightly edited from the verbatim transcript. An occasional passage has been added to expand the thought, an occasional sentence has been rewritten, but no attempt has been made to change the informal style of the original. Many of the footnotes have been added to the original, but a few were originally spoken asides in the talks themselves. And one thing you'll notice is that this conversational style actually has become quite influential in analytic philosophy since then. Even people that are writing things for print publication have adopted some of this conversational style. And then he says, I hope the reader will bear these facts in mind as he reads the text. Imagining it spoken with proper pauses and emphases may occasionally facilitate comprehension. I have agreed to publish the talks in this form with some reservations. The time allotted and the informal style necessitated a certain amount of compression of the argument, inability to treat certain objections and the like. Especially in the concluding sections on scientific identities and the mind-body problem, thoroughness had to be sacrificed. Some topics essential to a full presentation of the viewpoint argued here, especially that of existence statements and empty names, had to be omitted altogether. Further, the informality of the presentation may well have engendered a sacrifice of clarity at certain points. All these defects were accepted in the interest of early publication. I hope that perhaps I will have the chance to do a more thorough job later. To repeat, I hope the reader will bear in mind that he is largely reading informal lectures, not only when he encounters repetitions or infelicities, but also when he encounters irreverence or corn. Now, spoiler alert, Kripke never really ended up with a chance to publish a fuller version of this later. He actually has been quite famous as a philosopher who uh, makes a lot of very influential points and discusses them a lot and circulates informal drafts, but very little of it has been published. He published several works in the 1970s and early 80s, and then he went almost 20 years without publishing anything. He's published a few more things in the past 20 years, but much of his influence has come through conversations and lectures and things like that rather than written works. Um, in the description below, I'm going to link a discussion that he gave about 30 years later, maybe 40 years later, where he returns to some of these topics. And you'll get a bit more of a sense of what he is like as a person and how such a unique thinker as him might find it hard to actually write things up for publication and do so. And so it's a good thing for us that someone transcribed this talk and then published it. Okay, so let's begin. I hope that some people see some connection between the 2 topics in the title, that is naming and necessity. If not, anyway, such connections will be developed in the course of these talks. Furthermore, because of the use of tools involving reference and necessity in analytic philosophy today, our views on these topics really have wide-ranging implications for other problems in philosophy that traditionally might be thought far removed, like arguments over the mind-body problem or the so-called identity thesis. That's the question of whether the mind is identical to the activity of the physical body and the brain. Materialism in this form often now gets involved in very intricate ways in questions about what is necessary or contingent in identity of properties, questions like that. So it is really very important to philosophers who may want to work in many domains to get clear about these concepts. Okay, and these ellipses here indicate places where parts of the text have been skipped. The first topic in the pair of topics is naming. By a name here, I will mean a proper name, i.e. the name of a person, a city, a country, etc. It is well known that modern logicians also are very interested in definite descriptions, phrases of the form, the X such that phi X. For instance, the man who corrupted Hadleyburg. Now, if one and only one man ever corrupted Hadleyburg, then that man is the referent in the logician sense of that description. We will use the term name so that it does not include definite descriptions of that sort, but only those things which in ordinary language would be called proper names. If we want a common term to cover names and descriptions, we may use the term designator. It is a point made by Dinellan that under certain circumstances, a particular speaker may use a definite description to refer, not to the proper referent in the sense I've just defined it uh, of that description, but to something else which he wants to single out and which he thinks is the proper referent of the description, but which in fact isn't. I'm going to skip that footnote. I think it's not essential for the main point. So you may say, the man over there with the champagne in his glass is happy, though he actually only has water in his glass. Now, even though there is no champagne in his glass, and there may even be another man in the room who does have champagne in his glass, the speaker intended to refer, or maybe in some sense of refer, did refer, to the man he thought had the champagne in his glass. Nevertheless, I'm just going to use the term referent of the description to mean the object uniquely satisfying the conditions in the definite description. This is the sense in which it's been used in the logical tradition. So if you have a description of the form the x such that phi x, and there is exactly one x such that phi x, that is the referent of the description. So this is all just a way of him dismissing a point that's been raised recently in the literature at this point, and I think might be relevant for thinking about the difference between what a speaker means and what their language means. But Kripke is mainly going to be focusing on the language side of things. Now, what is the relation between names and descriptions? There is a well-known doctrine of John Stuart Mill in his book, A System of Logic, that names have denotation but not connotation. To use one of his examples, when we use the name Dartmouth to describe a certain locality in England, it may be so called because it lies at the mouth of the River Dart. But even, he says, had the Dart changed its course so that Dartmouth no longer lay at the mouth of the Dart, we could still with propriety call this place Dartmouth, even though the name may suggest that it lies at the mouth of the Dart. Changing Mill's terminology, perhaps we should say that a name such as Dartmouth does have a connotation to some people. Namely, it does connote, not to me, I never thought of this, that any place called Dartmouth lies at the mouth of the Dart. But then in some way it doesn't have a sense. At least it is not part of the meaning of the name Dartmouth that the town so named lies at the mouth of the Dart. Someone who said that Dartmouth did not lie at the Dart's mouth would not contradict himself. And so here he's distinguishing this idea of connotation, which is some sort of ideas associated with a name, from what Fraga has called the sense of a name, which is its meaning. And he's also distinguishing both from the reference of the name, which is the object that it stands for. And he's saying John Stuart Mill said that names have a reference, but no sense or other aspect of meaning. And that, of course, is what Frege argues against in his paper on sense and reference. Now, Kripke goes on, it should not be thought that every phrase of the form the x such that fx is always used in English as a description rather than a name. I guess everyone has heard about the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. I'm not sure if this, I think this article actually came out before the famous Saturday Night Live skit about that. Today we have the United Nations. Here it would seem that these things can be so called, even though they are not Holy Roman United Nations. These phrases should be regarded not as definite descriptions, but as names. And that's to say, something might look like a definite description, but it's actually a name. And I think this is what many people would say about something like the White House. The White House may be a white house, but the name doesn't mean it's the only white house. Uh, it's rather a name that is perhaps based on a description of the place. But even if it was no longer a house, even if it was no longer white, the name, the White House, would still refer to it. Uh, but that's all just to say that's very different from if you're looking on the street and there's only one White House, and you say, and someone asks, which house are you looking at? And I say, the White House. You might even notice that we tend to put the stress on a different syllable there. When you're using it as a description, you say the White House or the White House, the White House, I guess, as opposed to when you use it as a name, it's the White House. So anyway, he says, in the case of some terms, people might have doubts as to whether they're names or descriptions, like God. Does it describe God as the unique divine being, or is it a name of God? But such cases needn't necessarily bother us. Now here, I'm making a distinction which is certainly made in language. But the classical tradition of modern logic has gone very strongly against Mill's view. Frege and Russell both thought, and seemed to arrive at these conclusions independently of each other, that Mill was wrong in a very strong sense. Really, a proper name, properly used, simply was a definite description, abbreviated or disguised. Frege specifically said that such a description gave the sense of the name. So here he's talking about Frege's famous paper on sense and reference and Russell's paper on denoting. And then there's a footnote here where he talks about what Russell means by name, and Russell ends up using the word name a bit differently than Kripke does. Russell uses the word name only in the end uh, for certain very special words. And so Russell thinks the things we ordinarily call names are really descriptions, but something else is a name. And Kripke says, we're not going to use the word name Russell's way. We're going to use the word name the way that we do in ordinary language. It's something that looks like a name, uh, and maybe certain things that look like definite descriptions are actually names, but you can generally tell because they're capitalized, at least in English. Now, the reasons against Mill's view and in favor of the alternative view adopted by Frege and Russell, that is the view that names really have descriptions as their meaning, so that all of these denoting expressions are just like descriptions. So these arguments are really very powerful, and it is hard to see, though one might be suspicious of this view because names don't seem to be disguised descriptions, how the Frege-Russell view or some suitable variant can fail to be the case. Let me give an example of some of the arguments which seem conclusive in favor of the view of Frege and Russell. The basic problem for any view such as Mill's is how we can determine what the referent of a name as used by a speaker is. According to the description view, the answer is clear. If Joe Dokes is just short for the man who corrupted Hadleyburg, then whoever corrupted Hadleyburg uniquely is the referent of the name Joe Dokes. However, if there is not such a descriptive content to the name, then how do people ever use names to refer to things at all? Well, they may be in a position to point to some things and thus determine the references of certain names ostensibly. This was Russell's doctrine of acquaintance, which he thought the so-called genuine or proper names satisfied. But of course, ordinary names refer to all sorts of people, like Walter Scott, to whom we can't possibly point. That is, I can't point at someone, say, that's Walter Scott, and now use the word Walter Scott to refer to that person, because the person is dead, and I've never met him. And in fact, he died hundreds of years ago. But of course, ordinary names do refer to all sorts of people, like Walter Scott, to whom we can't possibly point. And our reference here seems to be determined by our knowledge of them. Whatever we know about them determines the referent of the name as the unique thing satisfying those properties. So this is Frege's idea. For example, if I use the name Napoleon and someone asks, to whom are you referring? I will answer something like, Napoleon was emperor of the French in the early part of the 19th century. He was eventually defeated at Waterloo, thus giving a uniquely identifying description to determine the referent of the name. Frege and Russell then appear to give the natural account of how reference is determined here. Mill appears to give none. That is, Mill just says, the name happens to refer to a person. How does it do so? It just does. Whereas Frege and Russell say, the name works because each name is associated with a description, and the description tells us which object, which person the name refers to. There are subsidiary arguments which, though they are based on more specialized problems, are also motivations for accepting the view. One is that sometimes we may discover that two names have the same referent and express this by an identity statement. So, for example, I guess this is a hackneyed example. That is, this example is used quite a lot in the literature. You see a star in the evening and it's called Hesperus. That's what we call it in the evening, is that right? I hope it's not the other way around. Here he's just joking that he can't remember which Greek name is the one for the evening star and which is the name for the morning star. But Hesperus is in fact the name that is Greek for the evening star. We see a star in the morning and call it Phosphorus. That means light bringer, or in fact Lucifer in Greek. And so it's the morning star, it's the star that brings light in the morning. Well, then in fact, we find that it's not a star, but is the planet Venus, and that Hesperus and Phosphorus are in fact the same. So we express this by the sentence, Hesperus is phosphorus. Here, we're certainly not just saying of an object that it's identical with itself. This is something that we discovered. A very natural thing to say is that the real content of what we said is that the star which we saw in the evening is the star which we saw in the morning. Or more accurately, that the thing which we saw in the evening is the thing which we saw in the morning. This then gives the real meaning of the identity statement in question, and the analysis in terms of descriptions does this. So that is, Frege says, how is it possible that we can discover a meaningful identity statement? How can we discover that the evening star is the morning star? How can we discover that Hesperus is phosphorus and have learned anything more than just that some object is itself? Well, the idea is that the name has a meaning, which is this description. And so when we discover that two descriptions refer to the same object, that is telling us something important about that object, that it has both of those properties. So there's a substantive discovery in an identity statement, even though an object being identical to itself is not a substantive statement. Also, we may raise the question whether a name has any reference at all when we ask, e.g., whether Aristotle ever existed. It seems natural here to think that what is questioned is not whether this thing existed. Once we've got the thing, we know that it existed. What really is queried is whether anything answers to the properties we associate with this name. In the case of Aristotle, whether any one Greek philosopher produced certain works, or at least a suitable number of them. It would be nice to answer all of these arguments. I'm not entirely able to see my way clear through every problem of this sort that can be raised. Furthermore, I'm pretty sure that I won't have time to discuss all these questions in these lectures. Nevertheless, I think it's pretty certain that the view of Frege and Russell is false. And now here's a footnote that's more relevant. When I speak of the Frege-Russell view and its variants, I include only those versions which give a substantive theory of the reference of names. In particular, Quine's proposal that in a canonical notation, a name such as Socrates should be replaced by a description, the Socratizer, where Socratizes is an invented predicate, and that the description should then be eliminated by Russell's method, was not intended as a theory of reference for names, but as a proposed reform of language with certain advantages. The problems discussed here will all apply, mutatis mutandis, to the reformed language. In particular, the question, how is the referent of Socrates determined, yields to the question, how is the extension of Socratizes determined? Of course, I do not suggest that Quine has ever claimed the contrary. Okay, so he's going to argue that this Frege, Russell, and then Quine theory is wrong, that the meaning of a name is not a description like this. Many people have said that the theory of Frege and Russell is false, but in my opinion, they've abandoned its letter while retaining its spirit. Namely, they've used the notion of a cluster concept. Well, what is this? The obvious problem for Frege and Russell, the one which comes immediately to mind, is already mentioned by Frege himself. He said, in the case of genuinely proper names like Aristotle, opinions as regards their sense may diverge. As such may, e.g., be suggested, Plato's disciple and the teacher of Alexander the Great. Whoever accepts this sense will interpret the meaning of the statement Aristotle was born in Stagira differently from one who interpreted the sense of Aristotle as the Stagirite teacher of Alexander the Great. As long as the nominatum, the reference, remains the same, these fluctuations in sense are tolerable. but they should be avoided in the system of a demonstrative science and should not appear in a perfect language. So that is, Frege is saying different people might have different definitions for the name, and for one person, the name, if the name Aristotle means the Stagirite teacher of Alexander the Great, then the sentence Aristotle was born in Stagira is going to be an analytic sentence. Whereas someone who thinks the name Aristotle means Plato's disciple who taught Alexander the Great is going to think that sentence is not analytic. You need to know something substantive about the world to know that Aristotle was born in Stagira. Whereas if you think that the name has being born in Stagira as part of the definition, then it's trivial. So according to Frege, there is some sort of looseness or weakness in our language. Some people may give one sense to the name Aristotle, others may give another. But of course, it is not only that. Even a single speaker, when asked, what description are you willing to substitute for the name, may be quite at a loss. In fact, he may know many things about him, but any particular thing that he knows, he may feel clearly expresses a contingent property of the object, that is, something that isn't necessarily true. If Aristotle meant the man who taught Alexander the Great, then saying Aristotle was a teacher of Alexander the Great would be a mere tautology. But surely it isn't. It expresses the fact that Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, something we could discover to be false. So, being the teacher of Alexander the Great cannot be part of the sense of the name. That is, here's Kripke's first argument against Frege's description theory. If a name was synonymous with a description, then certain statements about the name would be analytic, necessary, whatever. And Kripke is saying, for any description I can think of, this could have been false. It's not obviously trivial or a tautology. Uh, the idea is, I may not think that it's part of the definition of Aristotle that he taught Alexander the Great. Surely it's also not part of the definition that he was a student of Plato. Surely it's also any number of other things are not part of the definition of the name Aristotle. If they were part of the definition, then there would be no possible question as to whether or not they're true. And yet, for anything you think you know about Aristotle, you could also imagine what it would be for some classicist to dig up some old documents and discover, oh, Aristotle didn't actually do that thing that many people thought he did. The most common way out of this difficulty is to say, really, it's not a weakness in ordinary language that we can't substitute a particular description for the name. That's all right. What we really associate with a name is a family of descriptions. A good example of this is, if I can find it, in philosophical investigations, where the idea of family resemblances is introduced and with great power. And so here he's quoting Wittgenstein. Consider this example. If one says Moses did not exist, this may mean various things. It may mean the Israelites did not have a single leader when they withdrew from Egypt, or their leader was not called Moses, or there cannot have been anyone who accomplished all that the Bible relates of Moses. But when I make a statement about Moses, am I always ready to substitute some one of those descriptions for Moses? I shall perhaps say, by Moses, I understand the man who did what the Bible relates of Moses, or at any rate, a good deal of it. But how much? Have I decided how much must be proved false for me to give up my proposition as false? Has the name Moses got a fixed and unequivocal use for me in all possible cases? According to this view, and a locus classicus of it is Searle's article on proper names, the referent of a name is determined not by a single description, but by some cluster or family. Whatever in some sense satisfies enough or most of the family is the referent of the name. I shall return to this view later. It may seem, as an analysis of ordinary language, quite a bit more plausible than that of Frege and Russell. It may seem to keep all the virtues and remove the defects of this theory. That is, it keeps the virtues of explaining how it is that we can learn an identity between two different names and that can mean something substantive. When you learn that Superman is Clark Kent, what you learn is perhaps that this cluster of descriptions here and this cluster of descriptions here, in fact, denote the same person. So we still get Frege's solution to the puzzle of informative identities. We also get some answer to the question of how is it that a name is able to refer to an individual? How does that individual get picked up by means of some family of descriptions? Okay, now let me say And this will introduce us to another new topic before I really consider this theory of meaning, that there are two ways in which the cluster concept theory, or even the theory which requires a single description, can be viewed. One way of regarding it says that the cluster or the single description actually gives the meaning of the name. And when someone says Walter Scott, he means the man such that such and such and such and such, whatever that description is. Now, another view might be that even though the description in some sense doesn't give the meaning of the name, it is what determines its reference. And although the phrase Walter Scott isn't synonymous with the man such that such and such and such and such, or even maybe with the family, if something can be synonymous with a family, the family or the single description is what is used to determine to whom someone is referring when he says Walter Scott. Of course, if, when we hear his beliefs about Walter Scott, we find that they are actually much more nearly true of Salvador Dali, then according to this theory, the reference of this name is going to be Mr. Dali, not Scott. There are writers, I think, who explicitly deny that names have meaning at all, even more strongly than I would, but still use this picture of how the referent of the name gets determined. A good case in point is Paul Ziff, who says very emphatically that names don't have meanings at all, that they are not a part of language in some sense. But still, when he talks about how we determine what the reference of the name was, then he gives this picture. Unfortunately, I don't have the passage in question with me, but this is what he says. And here's the footnote. Ziff's most detailed statement of his version of the cluster of descriptions theory of the reference of names is in About God. A briefer statement is in his Semantic Analysis. The latter passage suggests that names of things with which we are acquainted should be treated somewhat differently, using ostension and baptism. Kripke is going to explain more later what that means, from names of historical figures, where the reference is determined by a cluster of associated descriptions. So that is, Ziff is saying, if I've met someone, then when I use their name, I just refer directly on the basis of my acquaintance with them. But if I haven't met someone, then I have some description of them in mind, and how the name refers is based on that description. But the idea is he's saying the name is not synonymous with the description, it's just that description explains how my use of the name refers to that person. And Kripke is going to deny that. He's going to deny that a description plays any role at all, at least any description like these. On page 93 of Semantic Analysis, Ziff states that simple, strong generalizations about proper names are impossible. One can only say what is so for the most part. Nevertheless, Ziff clearly states that a cluster of descriptions theory is a reasonable such rough statement, at least for historical figures. For Ziff's view that proper names ordinarily are not words of the language and ordinarily do not have meaning, see these pages of his Semantic Analysis. Okay, so the difference between using this theory, that is the cluster or description theory, as a theory of meaning and using it as a theory of reference will come out a little more clearly later on. But some of the attractiveness of the theory is lost if it isn't supposed to give the meaning of a name. For some of the solutions of problems that I've just mentioned will not be right, or at least won't clearly be right, if the description doesn't give the meaning of the name. For example, if someone said, Aristotle does not exist means there is no man who did all those things that we think Aristotle did, or in the example from Wittgenstein, Moses does not exist means no man did all the things described in the Bible. That might depend, and in fact I think does depend, on taking the theory in question as a theory of the meaning of the name Moses, not just as a theory of its reference. Well, I don't know. Perhaps all that is immediate now is the other way around. If Moses does mean the same as the man who did such and such, then to say that Moses did not exist is to say that the man who did such and such did not exist. That is, that no one person did such and such. If, on the other hand, Moses is not synonymous with any description, then even if its reference is in some sense determined by a description, statements containing the name cannot in general be analyzed by replacing the name by a description, though they may be materially equivalent to statements containing a description. Materially equivalent here means true in the same circumstances. So the analysis of singular existence statements mentioned above will have to be given up unless it is established by some special argument independent of a general theory of the meaning of names, and the same applies to identity statements. In any case, I think it's false that Moses exists means that at all, so we won't have to see if such a special argument can be drawn up. Those determinists who deny the importance of the individual in history may well argue that had Moses never existed, someone else would have arisen to achieve all that he did. Their claim cannot be refuted by appealing to a correct philosophical theory of the meaning of Moses exists. That is, someone who thinks all of history is somehow necessary, that even if Moses hadn't done the things that are described in the Bible, someone else would have. You can't refute them by saying what the meaning of names is. You have to refute them by talking about whether or not there are real laws of history. Names don't tell us how history works, history does. And so Kripke is saying we can't have a theory of names that just makes it automatically true that that certain historical theories are false. Before I go any further into this problem, I want to talk about another distinction which will be important in the methodology of these talks. Philosophers have talked, and of course there has been considerable controversy in recent years over the meaningfulness of these notions, about various categories of truth, which are called a priori, analytic, necessary, and sometimes even certain is thrown into this batch. So if you're familiar at all with Quine's paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, which I'll link in the description below, Quine calls into question whether there is a distinction between analytic and synthetic sentences. And that was a very influential view at the time that Kripke is speaking here. The terms are often used as if whether there are things answering to these concepts is an interesting question, but we might as well regard them all as meaning the same thing. That is, a priori, analytic, necessary. At the time that Kripke's writing, many philosophers think these basically mean the same thing. They're all just ways of saying that something must be true. Now, everyone remembers Kant a bit as making a distinction between a priori and analytic. So maybe this distinction is still made. In contemporary discussion, very few people, if any, distinguish between the concepts of statements being a priori and their being necessary. At any rate, I shall not use the terms a priori and necessary interchangeably here. And here Kripke is going to give us a refresher on the definitions of these terms because he thinks in 1970 that many analytic philosophers have forgotten the differences between these terms because they've been so interested in saying that they're all basically synonymous and that perhaps they're even questionable concepts to use at all if they're under the influence of Quine. So consider what the traditional characterizations of such terms as a priori and necessary are. First, the notion of a prioricity is a concept of epistemology. That is, it's about what we can know and how we can know it. I guess the traditional characterization from Kant goes something like, a priori truths are those which can be known independently of any experience. This introduces another problem before we get off the ground, because there's another modality in the characterization of a priori. Modality is about anything that isn't just what is true, but what should be, must be, can be, might be, ought to be. Any of those things are modalities. And so a priori is about what can be known to be true. And here he's saying there's an extra modality here. It's not just known, it's also can be known, something which can be known independently of any experience. That means that in some sense, it's possible, whether we do or do not, in fact, know it independently of any experience, to know this independently of any experience. And possible for whom? For God? For the Martians? Or just for people with minds like ours? To make this all clear might involve a host of problems all of its own about what sort of possibility is in question here. It might be best, therefore, to, instead of using the phrase a priori truth, to the extent that one uses it at all, to stick to the question of whether a particular person or knower knows something a priori or believes it true on the basis of a priori evidence. I won't go further too much into the problems that might arise with the notion of a prioricity here. I will say that some philosophers somehow change the modality in this characterization from can to must. They think that if something belongs to the realm of a priori knowledge, it couldn't possibly be known empirically. This is just a mistake. Something may belong in the realm of such statements that can be known a priori, but still may be known by particular people on the basis of experience. To give a really common sense example, anyone who has worked with a computing machine, in 1970, not all that many people had, even though nowadays we're all very familiar with computing machines. Anyone who's worked with a computing machine knows that the computing machine may give an answer to whether such and such a number is prime. No person has calculated or proved the number is prime, but the machine has given the answer, this number is prime. We then, if we believe that the number is prime, believe it on the basis of our knowledge of the laws of physics, the construction of the machine, and so on, and maybe also how we programmed it. We therefore do not believe this on the basis of purely a priori evidence. We believe it, if anything is a posteriori at all, on the basis of a posteriori evidence. That's just the opposite of a priori. That's something that depends on experience. Nevertheless, maybe this could be known a priori by someone who made the requisite calculations. So can be known a priori doesn't mean must be known a priori. Maybe an even simpler example would be that my friend could tell me something mathematical, and then you might think, is my knowledge a priori, or is it on the basis of the experience of my friend telling me? That's, anyway, an important question in epistemology. What is this distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge? Is it preserved by someone telling you? Can you get it from a computer? Whatever. But anyway, this is enough for Kripke's characterization of it. A priori is an epistemic concept. It's about how you know things. The second concept which is in question is that of necessity. Sometimes this is used in an epistemological way and might then just mean a priori. And of course, sometimes it is used in a physical way when people distinguish between physical and logical necessity. That is, you might think, it's physically necessary that the moon will just keep orbiting around the Earth. There's no way that the moon could stop orbiting around the Earth consistent with the physical laws. But it's not logically necessary that the moon continue to orbit around the Earth. Logically, the moon could suddenly cease to exist. The laws of gravity could stop working the way that we know about them. Physically, that's impossible, but logically, there's no contradiction in thinking that the laws of physics just suddenly change one day. But what I'm concerned with here is a notion which is not a notion of epistemology, but of metaphysics in some, I hope, non-pejorative sense. In much of the 20th century, analytic philosophers thought of metaphysics as the thing that we can't possibly know anything about and therefore shouldn't say anything about. Quine reintroduced metaphysics as a concept that perhaps analytic philosophers should sometimes say that they can do things about. But even by Kripke's time in 1970, not many people were happy with that. Whereas in the past 50 years, analytic philosophers have been, in many cases, very happy to do lots of metaphysics. And it's largely due to Kripke's influence here. So we ask whether something might have been true or might have been false. Well, if something is false, it's obviously not necessarily true. If it is true, might it have been otherwise? Is it possible that in this respect, the world should have been different from the way it is? If the answer is no, then this fact about the world is a necessary one. If the answer is yes, then this fact about the world is a contingent one. This, in and of itself, has nothing to do with anyone's knowledge of anything. This past week, it was very cold in Texas. It could easily have been otherwise had the world gone differently. And so the fact that it was very cold is not necessary. It was true, but it wasn't necessarily true. It was only contingently true. It's certainly a philosophical thesis and not a matter of obvious definitional equivalence, either that everything a priori is necessary or that everything necessary is a priori. Both concepts may be vague. That may be another problem, but at any rate, they're dealing with two different domains, two different areas, the epistemological and the metaphysical. Consider, say, Fermat's last theorem, or the Goldbach conjecture. The Goldbach conjecture says that an even number greater than 2 must be the sum of two prime numbers. If this is true, it is presumably necessary, and if it is false, presumably necessarily false. We are taking the classical view of mathematics here and assume that in mathematical reality it is either true or false. If the Goldbach conjecture is false, then there is an even number, n, greater than 2, such that for no primes p1 and p2, both less than n, does n equal p1 plus p2. This fact about n, if true, is verifiable by direct computation, and thus is necessary if the results of arithmetical computations are necessary. On the other hand, if the conjecture is true, then every even number exceeding 2 is the sum of 2 primes. Could it then be the case that although in fact every such even number is the sum of 2 primes, there might have been such an even number which was not the sum of 2 primes? What would that mean? Such a number would have to be one of 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. And by hypothesis, since we are assuming Goldbach's conjecture to be true, each of these can be shown, again by direct computation, to be the sum of 2 primes. Goldbach's conjecture, then, cannot be contingently true or false. Whatever truth value it has belongs to it by necessity. That is, if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then it couldn't possibly have failed to equal 4. It's not like if it rained yesterday, then it could have failed to rain yesterday. It happened to rain yesterday, but that didn't have to be true. Whereas if 2 plus 2 is 4, then that had to be true. What we can say, of course, is that right now, since no one has proved Goldbach's conjecture true and no one has proved it false, as far as we know, the question can come out either way. So in the absence of a mathematical proof deciding this question, none of us has any a priori knowledge about this question in either direction. We don't know whether Goldbach's conjecture is true or false. So right now, we certainly don't know anything a priori about it. So Kripke's point here is there's a statement that is either necessarily true or necessarily false, and yet at this point, it is not a priori known to be true or false. So here he is at least softening us up for the idea that being necessary and being a priori might be distinct. Although I think his argument suggests that if something is a priori, it might be necessary, though we'll come later on to specific arguments he gives that there can be a priori truths that are contingent. And that might seem very surprising right now, given everything he said, but that will be something he gives a fairly convincing argument for later on, but we have to build up to it. So the terms necessary and a priori, then, as applied to statements, are not obvious synonyms. There may be a philosophical argument connecting them, perhaps even identifying them, but an argument is required, not simply the observation that the two terms are clearly interchangeable. I will argue below that in fact they are not even coextensive. The necessary a posteriori truths and probably contingent a priori truths both exist. Coextensive is just a philosophical term meaning that two concepts apply to the same objects. And the classic example of two distinct concepts that apply to the same objects are creature with a heart and creature with a kidney. As a matter of fact, every creature that has a heart has a kidney and vice versa. Those concepts are coextensive, but they're not the same concept because one is about having a heart, the other is about having a kidney. Another term used in philosophy is analytic. Here, it won't be too important to get any clearer about this in the talk. The common examples of analytic statements nowadays are like, bachelors are unmarried. That is, it's a sentence that's true by definition. The definition of a bachelor is that he's unmarried. Kant, someone just pointed out to me, gives as an example gold as a yellow metal, which seems to me to be an extraordinary example because it's something I think that could turn out to be false. I think here Kripke is imagining maybe we discover that what we always thought was always gold mixed with a little bit of copper, and that modern chemistry allows us to identify pure gold, and that perhaps we could discover that pure gold is not yellow, even though we've been mistaken and thought so all along. It's not yellow by definition, is I think Kripke's idea, though this is a question that he doesn't really come back to, and which may be addressed more by Hilary Putnam in his paper, The Meaning of Meaning. So at any rate, let's just make it a matter of stipulation that an analytic statement is, in some sense, true by virtue of its meaning, and true in all possible worlds by virtue of its meaning. Then something which is analytically true will be both necessary and a priori. That's sort of stipulative. So that is, he's saying, let's just say to be analytic is to be true in virtue of meaning, and if it's true in virtue of the meaning, then that seems to mean that it should be a priori, because if we know the meanings of the words, then we should be able to figure out that it's true. And he thinks if it's true in virtue of meaning, then it's necessarily true also. Another category I mentioned was that of certainty. Whatever certainty is, it's clearly not obviously the case that everything which is necessary is certain. Certainty is another epistemological notion. Something can be known, or at least rationally believed, a priori, without being quite certain. You've read a proof in the math book, and though you think it's correct, maybe you've made a mistake. You often do make mistakes of this kind. You've made a computation, perhaps with an error. So he's just saying, no matter how good your mathematical proof is, even if it suffices for a priori knowledge, it usually doesn't suffice for absolute certainty. Certainty is when you don't think there's any possibility you could be wrong. Okay, so now he's going to give us yet one more definition for another important concept. All of this is eventually going to have payoff later on. For now, he's just giving us a bunch of definitions. Let's use some terms quasi-technically. Let's call something a rigid designator if, in every possible world, it designates the same object, and a non-rigid or accidental designator if that is not the case. Of course, we don't require that the objects exist in all possible worlds. Certainly, Nixon might not have existed if his parents had not gotten married in the normal course of things. When we think of a property as essential to an object, we usually mean that it is true of that object in any case where it would have existed. A rigid designator of a necessary existent can be called strongly rigid. So that is, he's saying, Nixon could have failed to exist. It's certainly not necessary that Nixon existed. Things could have ended up going differently so that Nixon never existed. However, there are certain things that we think of as essential to Nixon. For instance, Nixon, if he existed, was going to be a human. He couldn't have been a table. He couldn't have been a cat. It wouldn't have been him if it had been one of those things. That's at least the intuition that Kripke's wanting us to have here. But he's thinking there are some things that are essential of Nixon, and one of the things he's going to suggest, one of the intuitive theses I will maintain in these talks is that names are rigid designators. Certainly, they seem to satisfy the intuitive test mentioned above. Although someone other than the actual US president in 1970 might have been the US president in 1970, e.g. Humphrey might have, the 1968 election was in fact very close, and Nixon could have lost it, and Humphrey could have won it. But no one other than Nixon might have been Nixon. That is, it seems correct to say the US president in 1970 could have been Hubert Humphrey, but it doesn't seem correct to say Nixon could have been Humphrey, even though the US president in 1970 is Nixon. So these names, something's going on with these different ways of designating the same person. This looks a lot like Fraga's puzzle, but Kripke's going to do something slightly different with it. In the same way, a designator rigidly designates a certain object if it designates that object wherever the object exists. If, in addition, the object is a necessary existent, the designator can be called strongly rigid. For example, the phrase, the president of the US in 1970, designates a certain man, Nixon, but someone else, e.g. Humphrey, might have been the president in 1970 and Nixon might not have. So this designator is not rigid. So it is the designator, the president of the US in 1970 is not a rigid designator. It refers to one person in this world, would have referred to someone else in a different world had the election gone differently. In these lectures, I will argue intuitively that proper names are rigid designators. For although the man Nixon might not have been the president, it is not the case that he might not have been Nixon, though he might not have been called Nixon. This is an important thing to keep in mind. He's going to explain this a bit more later. Being called Nixon is not a necessary property of the person, but being Nixon is a necessary property of the person. Those who've argued that to make sense of the notion of rigid designator, we must antecedently make sense of criteria of trans-world identity, have precisely reversed the cart and the horse. It is because we can refer rigidly to Nixon and stipulate that we are speaking of what might have happened to him under certain circumstances, that trans-world identifications are unproblematic in such cases. Of course, I don't imply that language contains a name for every object. Demonstratives can be used as rigid designators. That is, you can point at something and say, that is a table that is in this room. that didn't have to be the table that was in this room. There could have been a different table in this room. That still would have been a table. That could have been broken down for firewood last week, but it wasn't. And so that could have failed to exist. However, this word that refers to that object and refers to the same object across all these possible worlds, including worlds where it doesn't exist, including worlds where I did something different to it, and including worlds where I never bothered pointing at it and naming it that. The idea is that when I name it, I pick it up, and then I'm using that same name in the actual world to refer to that object across possible worlds. And he says demonstratives can be used that way, as can names. And free variables can be used as rigid designators of unspecified objects. So that is, say, something like, let X be some object. X could have failed to exist, or X could have had different properties than it actually does. And he's saying in this sort of usage, we're using that word X to refer to an object rigidly. Of course, when we specify a counterfactual situation, that is something other than what's actually the case, how things could have been, we do not describe the whole possible world, but only the portion which interests us. So if that table had been chopped up for firewood last week, that's describing some possible world, some way things could have been other than the actual world. But that way things could have been is not, I haven't fully specified everything that happens in that world. I haven't specified which particular possible world I'm talking about. The tendency to demand purely qualitative descriptions of counterfactual situations has many sources. So qualitative means here describing things just in terms of what they look like or what their properties are like, rather than what the individual objects are. One source of this is perhaps the confusion of the epistemological and the metaphysical between a prioricity and necessity. If someone identifies necessity with a prioricity and thinks that objects are named by means of uniquely identifying properties, he may think that it is the properties used to identify the object which, being known about it a priori, must be used to identify it in all possible worlds, to find out which object is Nixon. As against this, I repeat, 1. Generally, things aren't found out about a counterfactual situation, they are stipulated. That is, I'm saying, imagine the world where Nixon wasn't president in 1970. We don't have to discover whether or not Nixon was president in 1970. We just are given that he wasn't president in that world in 1970. 2, possible worlds need not be given purely qualitatively, as if we were looking at them through a telescope. That is, I'm not telling you what Nixon looks like in that world. If I were using a telescope to look at another planet, I might tell you what things look like on the surface of that planet. But that wouldn't tell us which object it is there. And of course, the objects on another planet would not be the same objects as on this planet. But other possible worlds are other ways the same objects could have been. This is Kripke's idea. And so Nixon could have been disguised as Humphrey. In fact, we could imagine a world where Nixon was disguised as Humphrey and Humphrey was disguised as Nixon, and Humphrey becomes president. And if you were to look at that world, you might not realize that it's a different person who's president there, but it would be a different person. And that's what Kripke's getting at here. He's suggesting we can imagine a world where someone who looks just like Nixon and has many of Nixon's properties is president, even though it's not actually Nixon. Above, I said that the Fraga-Russell view that names are introduced by description could be taken either as a theory of the meaning of names, Fraga and Russell seem to take it this way, or merely as a theory of their reference. Let me give an example not involving what would usually be called a proper name to illustrate this. Suppose someone stipulates that 100 degrees centigrade is to be the temperature at which water boils at sea level. This isn't completely precise because the pressure may vary at sea level. Of course, historically, a more precise definition was given later, but let's suppose that this were the definition. Another sort of example in literature is that 1 meter is to be the length of S, where S is a certain stick or bar in Paris. Usually people who like to talk about these definitions then try to make the length of into an operational concept, but it's not important. In case you don't know, this is actually something that at least at some point, there was an object in Paris that was defined as the meter, and all other objects are measured in comparison to that object. Wittgenstein says something very puzzling about this. He says, there is one thing of which one can neither say that it is 1 meter long, nor that it is not 1 meter long, and that is the standard meter in Paris. But this is, of course, not to ascribe any extraordinary property to it, but only to mark its peculiar role in the language game of measuring with a meter rule. This seems to be a very extraordinary property, actually, for any stick to have. I think he must be wrong. If the stick is a stick, for example, 39.37 inches long, I assume we have some different standard for inches, why isn't it 1 meter long? Anyway, let's suppose that he's wrong and that the stick is 1 meter long. Part of the problem which is bothering Wittgenstein is, of course, that this stick serves as a standard of length, and so we can't attribute length to it. Be this as it may, well, it may not be. Is the statement stick S is 1 meter long a necessary truth? Of course, its length might vary in time. We could make the definition more precise by stipulating that 1 meter is to be the length of S at a fixed time, t0. Maybe that's January 1st, 1900 at midnight. It is then a necessary truth that stick S is 1 meter. Is it then necessary truth that stick S is 1 meter long at time t0? Someone who thinks that everything one knows a priori is necessary might think, this is the definition of a meter. By definition, stick S is 1 meter long at t0. That's a necessary truth. But there seems to me to be no reason so to conclude, even for a man who uses the stated definition of 1 meter. For he's using this definition not to give the meaning of what he called the meter, but to fix the reference. For such an abstract thing as a unit of length, the notion of reference may be unclear, but let's suppose it's clear enough for the present purposes. He uses it to fix a reference. There is a certain length which he wants to mark out. He marks it out by an accidental property, namely that there is a stick of that length. Someone else might mark out the same reference by another accidental property. But in any case, even though he uses this to fix the reference of his standard of length, a meter, he can still say, if heat had been applied to this stick S at t0, then at t0, stick S would not have been 1 meter long. That is, Kripke is saying, even if we use this particular stick as a definition of a meter, that doesn't mean the claim that this stick is a meter long is necessary. We can certainly imagine that the stick could have been cut before this time. It could have been changed. It could have been altered. It could have been other than it actually is. The definition of the meter is how long it actually is, and we refer to that same length even when we're talking about other worlds. I can say, let's use this stick as the definition of a meter, and let's imagine what would have been the case if this stick, this very stick, had been half a meter long. And we wouldn't, that doesn't seem contradictory. So that is, the word meter cannot mean the length of this stick. It means the length that this stick actually is, even though it could have been a different length. Whereas the length of this stick is a phrase that refers to a different length in different worlds. So that's what Kripke is saying is going on with descriptions. Descriptions have a meaning. The phrase, the president in 1970, has a meaning which picks out one person in this world. Nixon could have picked out a different person in another world. Humphrey could have picked out someone else if history had gone very differently. But that phrase has a meaning, and he thinks no name has that meaning because the name refers to the same person in all the worlds. And this description does not. This description refers to different people. And so the name, if it's related to the description, at most it can be related to using the description to pick out which actual person the name refers to. But the meaning of the name is not the same as the meaning of the description. Okay, so here we come to his lecture 2. Last time we ended up talking about a theory of naming, which is given by a number of theses here on the board. 1. To every name or designating expression X, there corresponds a cluster of properties, namely the family of those properties phi, such that A believes phi X. 2. One of the properties, or some conjointly, are believed by A to pick out some individual uniquely. 3. If most, or a weighted most, of the phi's are satisfied by one unique object Y, then Y is the referent of X. 4. If the vote yields no unique object, X does not refer. 5. The statement, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's, is known a priori by the speaker. 6. The statement, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's, expresses a necessary truth in the idiolect of the speaker. Idiolect here means that particular person's use of language. So here he's describing a theory that is based on one particular person's knowledge. This is the version of the description or cluster description view of names. And the idea is each of us has our own set of descriptions that we think of with a name. Maybe I think of one set of descriptions for the name Aristotle, you think of a different set, but for each of us, we have some definition of the name. And on this theory, that definition is based on this cluster of properties, and it's the properties that I believe to pick out this person. And if there is a person that satisfies most or enough of these descriptions, then that is who the name picks up. Whereas if there is no person who satisfies enough of these descriptions, then my use of the name fails to refer to anyone. And it is knowable a priori by me that if there is a person who this name picks up, then it is the person who has most of these descriptions. And furthermore, this statement is a necessary and a priori truth. That is all part of this cluster of descriptions theory of names. Then there's this condition C. For any successful theory, the account must not be circular. The properties which are used in the vote must not themselves involve the notion of reference in such a way that it is ultimately impossible to eliminate. C is not a thesis, but a condition on the satisfaction of the other theses. In other words, theses 1 to 6 cannot be satisfied in a way which leads to a circle, in a way which does not lead to any independent determination of reference. That is, the cluster theory says theses 1 through 6 give us the definition of refer, give us what meaning is. And condition C is just saying it shouldn't be that we give the definition of reference in terms of things that themselves involve the concept of reference. So the example I gave last time of a blatantly circular attempt to satisfy these conditions, last time I think that was not in the excerpt that we read, was a theory of names well mentioned by William Neal. I was a little surprised at the statement of the theory when I was reading what I had copied down, so I looked it up again. I looked it up in the book to see if I'd copied it down accurately. Neal did use the past tense. He said that though it is not trifling to be told that Socrates was the greatest philosopher of ancient Greece, it is trifling to be told that Socrates was called Socrates. Trifling here means trivial. That is, he thinks, Neal is saying, there's a significant fact that you learned when you learned that Socrates was the greatest philosopher of ancient Greece. However, Neal thinks there is no significant fact you learn when you learn that Socrates was called Socrates. This is how Neal is suggesting that the meaning of the name is being called by that name. The meaning of the name cannot be synonymous with any other description because any other such description, he thinks, is a significant fact. So therefore, Neal concludes, the name Socrates must simply mean the individual called Socrates. Bertrand Russell, as I've said, in some places gives a similar analysis. Anyway, as stated using the past tense, this condition wouldn't be circular, because one certainly could decide to use the term Socrates to refer to whoever was called Socrates by the Greeks. But of course, in that sense, it is not at all trifling to be told that Socrates was called Socrates. If this is any kind of fact, it might in fact be false. Perhaps we know that we call him Socrates. That hardly shows that the Greeks did so. In fact, of course, they might have pronounced the name differently. They probably pronounced it Socrates. It may be, in the case of this particular name, that transliteration from the Greek is so good that the English version is not pronounced very differently from the Greek, but that won't be so in the general case. Certainly, it is not trifling to be told that Isaiah was called Isaiah. In fact, it is false to be told that Isaiah was called Isaiah. The prophet wouldn't have named this name at all, wouldn't have recognized this name at all. And we can think of further examples that St. Peter wasn't called Peter until very late in his life. And in fact, he was never called Peter. He was always called by some Greek or other version of that word. Of course, the Greeks didn't call their country anything like Greece. Suppose we amend the thesis so that it reads, It's trifling to be told that Socrates is called Socrates by us, or at least by me, the speaker. Then in some sense, this is fairly trifling. I don't think it is necessary or analytic. In the same way, it is trifling to be told that horses are called horses without this leading to the conclusion that the word horse simply means the animal called a horse. As a theory of the reference of the name Socrates, it will lead immediately to a vicious circle. So that is, when we're talking here, uh, it's trivial. If someone asks you what are horses, it wouldn't be very helpful for them to say, horses are the things that we call horses. That won't help them figure out what the word is. But that doesn't mean that that's the meaning of the word. In fact, the meaning of the word horse, presumably it's something more complex. But even though this trivial fact, the fact that this is trivial is not enough to tell us that that's the meaning. And I think this is a sort of rock in the hard place here, that Neil wants to say, whatever the meaning of a name is, it can't be something that makes certain facts about the object too substantive, too trivial. If the meaning of the name Socrates was the person who taught Plato, then the fact that Socrates taught Plato would be a relatively trivial thing. That would be just telling you the meaning of the name. Just like saying that the meaning of the word horse is that it's a certain type of animal means that horses are animals is a trivial statement of a certain sort. But we also don't want to say that anything trivial just gives us the meaning, because it's trivial to say that horses are called horses, but that doesn't tell us the meaning of the word horse. If one was determining the referent of a name like Glunk to himself and made the following decision, I shall use the term glunk to refer to the man that I call Glunk. This would get one nowhere. One had better have some independent determination of the referent of Glunk. This is a good example of blatantly circular determination. Actually, sentences like Socrates is called Socrates are very interesting, and one can spend, strange as it may seem, hours talking about their analysis. I actually did once do that. I won't do that, however, on this occasion. See how high the seas of language can rise, and at the lowest points, too. That is, he's telling us, language is such a difficult ocean to navigate, and sometimes it gets really choppy with the waves and difficult to sail, clearly. And this should be one of the easiest things. Saying Socrates is called Socrates doesn't look like it's saying much, but he says there's a lot to think about there. William Neil thought that this would be a good definition of the meaning of names, and Kripke says, if that's a definition, it's circular, so it fails condition C. Anyway, this is all a useful example of a violation of the non-circularity condition. The theory will satisfy all those statements, perhaps, but it satisfies them only because there is some independent way of determining the reference, independently of the particular condition being the man called Socrates. I've already talked about in the last lecture Thesis 6. That is the statement, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's, expresses a necessary truth. Theses 5 and 6, by the way, have converses. 5 is the one that this statement is known a priori. What I said for thesis 5 is that the statement that if X exists, X has most of the phi's is a priori true for the speaker. It will also be true under the given theory that certain converses of the statement hold true also a priori for the speaker. Namely, if anything has most of the properties phi in the properly weighted sense, then it is X. Similarly, a certain converse to this will be necessarily true. Namely, if anything has most of the properties in the properly weighted sense, it is X. So really one can say that it is both a priori and necessary that something is X if and only if it uniquely has most of the properties phi. Again, here, this passage, this is not Kripke telling us what he thinks. This is Kripke telling us what this earlier cluster theory of names predicts. And that's the theory that is the modified version of the Frege-Russell theory due to people like Searle and Ziff. And this really comes from the previous theses 1 through 4, I suppose. That is the thesis that for the name there exists a cluster. One of some collection of these definitions in the cluster are believed to pick out the individual. If most or a weighted most of the properties are satisfied by one object, then that's the referent of it. And if their vote yields no object, then the term doesn't refer. So if you accept all that, then the statement, if x exists, then x has most of the phi's, and whatever has most of the phi's is x, these statements would have to be a priori and necessary. So 5 and 6 really just say that a sufficiently reflective speaker grasps this theory of proper names. Knowing this, he therefore sees that 5 and 6 are true. The objections to theses 5 and 6 will not be that some speakers are unaware of this theory and therefore don't know these things. What I talked about in the last lecture is thesis 6. It's been observed by many philosophers that if the cluster of properties associated with a proper name is taken in a very narrow sense, so that only one property is given any weight at all, let's say one definite description to pick out the referent. For example, Aristotle was the philosopher who taught Alexander the Great. Then certain things will seem to turn out to be necessary truths which are not necessary truths. In this case, for example, that Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. But as Searle said, it is not a necessary truth, but a contingent one that Aristotle ever went into pedagogy. That is, even if the only fact you knew about Aristotle was that he taught Alexander the Great, you might still think, even though he did teach Alexander the Great, he could have done something else with his life. He could have not become a teacher. Therefore, Searle concludes that one must drop the original paradigm of a single description and turn to that of a cluster of descriptions. To summarize some things that I argued last time, this is not the correct answer, whatever it may be, to this problem about necessity. For Searle goes on to say, suppose we agree to drop Aristotle and use, say, the teacher of Alexander. Then it is a necessary truth that the man referred to as Alexander's teacher. But it is a contingent fact that Aristotle ever went into pedagogy, though I am suggesting that it is a necessary fact that Aristotle has the logical sum, inclusive disjunction, of properties commonly attributed to him. That is, Searle is saying, there's no one definition which is sufficient to pick out Aristotle, but think about all the facts about him. It is logically necessary that Aristotle had at least one of those properties. And Kripke says, this is what is not so. It just is not, in any intuitive sense of necessity, a necessary truth that Aristotle had the properties commonly attributed to him. There is a certain theory, perhaps popular in some views of the philosophy of history, which might both be deterministic and yet at the same time assign a great role to the individual in history. Perhaps Carlyle would associate with the meaning of the name of a great man his achievements. According to such a view, it will be necessary, once a certain individual is born, that he is destined to perform various great tasks, and so it will be part of the very nature of Aristotle that he should have produced ideas which had a great influence on the Western world. Whatever the merits of such a view may be as a view of history, or the nature of great men, it does not seem that it should be trivially true on the basis of a theory of proper names. It would seem that it's a contingent fact that Aristotle ever did any of the things commonly attributed to him today, any of these great achievements that we so much admire. That is, Kripke is saying, Searle says it's logically necessary that Aristotle did at least some of the things that we know about him. And Kripke is saying, no, that's not just logically necessary. Maybe this is true as a theory of history. Maybe if Thomas Carlyle, the historian, is right, that would be true. But that would be a substantive theory about history, not just a consequence, a trivial logical consequence of the theory of names. Aristotle, even though he in fact may have done many of these things, could have failed to do any of them. To clear up one thing which some people have asked me, when I say that a designator is rigid and designates the same thing in all possible worlds, I mean that as used in our language, it stands for that thing when we talk about counterfactual situations. I don't mean, of course, that there mightn't be counterfactual situations in which in the other possible worlds, people actually spoke a different language. One doesn't say that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is contingent because people might have spoken a language in which 2 plus 2 equals 4 meant that 7 is even. Maybe to make this more concrete, imagine a world where people use a different language. Imagine a world where people use the word 4 to refer to the number 7. He says, nevertheless, even though there's some other world where people use the word 4 differently, the sentence that we mean when we say 2 plus 2 equals 4, that sentence is necessarily true. Those people would have expressed that same thought with a different sentence. but the sentence we express by our word 2 + 2 = 4 is necessarily true. Similarly, Kripke is saying the name Nixon refers to one person, and it refers to that person rigidly, even if in that other world, people had used the name Nixon to refer to someone else. So he says, similarly, when we speak of a counterfactual situation, we speak of it in English, even if it is part of the description of that counterfactual situation that we were all speaking German in that counterfactual situation. We say, suppose we had all been speaking German, or suppose we had been using English in a non-standard way. Then we are describing a possible world or counterfactual situation in which people, including ourselves, did speak in a certain way different from the way we speak. But still, in describing that world, we use English with our meanings and our references. It is in this sense that I speak of a rigid designator as having the same reference in all possible worlds. I also don't mean to imply that the thing designated exists in all possible worlds, just that the name refers rigidly to that thing. If you say, suppose Hitler had never been born, then Hitler refers here, still rigidly, to something that would not exist in the counterfactual situation described. Given these remarks, this means we must cross off Thesis 6 as incorrect. Remember, Thesis 6 is the one that says it is necessary that a person satisfy most of the descriptions that are associated with that name. The other theses have nothing to do with necessity and can survive. In particular, Thesis 5 has nothing to do with necessity and it can survive. Thesis 5 is the one that says it is a priori that if someone satisfies most of these descriptions, then they are the person whose name we're talking about. So he says, if I use the name Hesperus to refer to a certain planetary body when seen in a certain celestial position in the evening, it will not therefore be a necessary truth that Hesperus is ever seen in the evening. That depends on various contingent facts about people being there to see and things like that. So even if I should say to myself that I will use Hesperus to name the heavenly body I see in the evening in yonder position of the sky, it will not be necessary that Hesperus was ever seen in the evening, but it may be a priori in that this is how I have determined the referent. If I have determined that Hesperus is the thing that I saw in the evening over there, then I will know just from making that determination of the referent that if there is any Hesperus at all, it's the thing I saw in the evening. This at least survives as far as the arguments we have given up now go. So here he's already said, here's a statement that could be a priori without being necessary, that Hesperus is the thing that is seen in the evening. How about a theory where Thesis 6 is eliminated? Theses 2, 3, and 4 turn out to have a large class of counter instances. 2, 3, and 4 are the ones that that say there's some property that I believe picks out an object uniquely, and that those properties are satisfied by one unique object, and that the name doesn't refer if there is no object satisfying those properties. He's going to show these principles also are false. So he says, how about a theory where Thesis 6 is eliminated? Well, Theses 2, 3, and 4 turn out to have a large class of counter instances, which we'll get to. Even when Theses 2 through 4 are true, Thesis 5 is usually false. The truth of Theses 3 and 4 is an empirical accident, which the speaker hardly knows a priori. That is to say, other principles really determine the speaker's reference, and the fact that the referent coincides with that determined by 2 through 4 is an accident, which we were in no position to know a priori. Only in a rare class of cases, usually initial baptisms, are all of 2 through 5 true. He'll define what that means a little bit later. So what picture of naming do these theses 1 through 5 give you? The picture is this. So here is the theory that rejects the necessity of the names, but still accepts the rest of the cluster theory. And this is a theory that Kripke thinks is more plausible than the initial cluster theory, but he thinks it's still false. The picture is this. I want to name an object. I think of some way of describing it uniquely, and then I go through, so to speak, a sort of mental ceremony. By Cicero, I shall mean the man who denounced Catiline. And that's what the reference of Cicero will be. I will use Cicero to designate rigidly the man who in fact denounced Catiline. So I can speak of possible worlds in which he did not. But still, my intentions are given by first giving some condition which uniquely determines an object, then using a certain word as a name for the object determined by this condition. Now, there may be some cases in which we actually do this. Maybe, if you want to stretch and call it description, when you say, I shall call that heavenly body over there Hesperus. That is really a case where the theses not only are true, but even give a correct picture of how the reference is determined. Another case, if you want to call this a name, might be when the police in London use the name Jack or Jack the Ripper to refer to the man, whoever he is, who committed all these murders, or most of them. Then they are giving the reference of the name by a description. But in many or most cases, I think the theses are false. So let's look at them. Okay, there's 3 footnotes there. Let's go through those footnotes. So he's saying, this is a way that language could have worked. This is what a theory of language might say, that there are some descriptions that are used to pick out an object, and it is just a priori knowable that if there is an object that satisfies the descriptions, that's what the name refers to. And it's a priori that if the name refers at all, it refers to whoever satisfies those descriptions. So he says, footnote 33, compared to Hesperus, an even better case of determining the reference of a name by description as opposed to ostension. So description is where you name a property, ostension is where you point. So when I say that over there is Hesperus, that's ostension. When I say the bright object that I saw on the evening of February 22nd, that is description. And he says, the discovery of the planet Neptune was like this. Neptune was hypothesized as the planet which caused such and such discrepancies in the orbits of certain other planets. If Leverrier indeed gave the name Neptune to the planet before it was ever seen, that is the history, in fact, he was observing the orbit of the planet Uranus, detected that it was not matching Newtonian theory, but figured out that if there was another planet out there, that would perturb the orbit in just this way. And he sent a telegram to his friend in Berlin and said, can you point your telescope right there and tell me, is there a planet you see? And they did discover the planet. That's Neptune. So if Leverrier indeed gave the name Neptune to the planet before it was ever seen, then he fixed the reference of Neptune by means of the description just mentioned. At that time, he was unable to see the planet even through a telescope. At this stage, an a priori material equivalence held between the statements Neptune exists and some one planet perturbing the orbit of such and such other planets exists in such and such a position. And also such statements as if such and such perturbations are caused by a planet, they are caused by Neptune, had the status of a priori truths. Nevertheless, they were not necessary truths, since Neptune was introduced as a name rigidly designating a certain planet. Leverrier could well have believed that if Neptune had been knocked off its course 1 million years earlier, it would have caused no such perturbations, and even that some other object might have caused the perturbations in its place. So that's all to say, this name Neptune perhaps works the way that theses 1 through 5 say, but this name still falsifies thesis 6. And then he says, footnote 34, following Donnellan's remarks on definite descriptions, we should add that in some cases an object may be identified and the reference of a name fixed using a description which may turn out to be false of its object. The case where the reference of phosphorus is determined as the morning star, which later turns out not to be a star, is an obvious example. In such cases, the description which fixes the reference clearly is in no sense known a priori to hold of the object, though a more cautious substitute may be. If such a more cautious substitute is available, it is really the substitute which fixes the reference in the sense intended in the text. And footnote 35, some of the theses are sloppily stated in respect of fussy matters like use of quotation marks and related details. For example, theses 5 and 6, as stated, presuppose that the speaker's language is English. Since the purport of the theses is clear and they are false anyway, I have not bothered to set these things straight. Okay, so he's saying, Fraga and Searle and others thought theses 1 through 6 were all correct, that the meaning of a name was given by a cluster of descriptions, and that it was both necessary and a priori that whatever satisfies those descriptions is the referent of the name and vice versa. And then Kripke points out, it's clearly not necessary that the referent of the name satisfy these descriptions. Neptune does perturb the orbit of Uranus, and it was defined as the name was maybe placed by using that definition, but Still, it could have been the case that Neptune had been hit by something else from another time, at another time, and it wouldn't have perturbed the orbit of Uranus. So that still leaves a version of the theory on which theses 1 through 5 is true. And I think this is also what Kripke is saying about the standard meter stick. We use the standard meter stick to fix the meaning of 1 meter, but that doesn't mean that this object was necessarily 1 meter long. This object could have failed to be a meter long, even if it's a priori that it is a meter long, and it's a priori that Neptune does perturb Uranus. Now he says, thesis 1 is, as I say, a definition. Thesis 2 says that one of the properties believed by A of the object, or some conjointly, are believed to pick out some individual uniquely. A sort of example people have in mind is just what I said. I shall use the term Cicero to denote the man who denounced Catiline, or first denounced him in public, to make it unique. This picks out an object uniquely in this particular reference. Even some writers such as Ziff in semantic analysis, who don't believe that names have meaning in any sense, think that this is a good picture of the way reference can be determined. And here he's saying that might be true of names like Neptune and terms like the meter. But he's going to argue theses 2 through 4 that there are some descriptions that pick out a unique individual, and that if any individual exists that is picked out by the name, then it must satisfy those descriptions. He's going to argue those theses are all generally false, even if they might be true in the Neptune case. So let's see if thesis 2 is true. It seems in some a priori way that it's got to be true, because if you don't think that the properties you have in mind pick out anyone uniquely, let's say they're all satisfied by 2 people, then how can you say which one of them you're talking about? There seem to be no grounds for saying you're talking about the one rather than about the other. Usually the properties in question are supposed to be some famous deeds of the person in question. For example, Cicero was the man who denounced Catiline. The average person, according to this, when he refers to Cicero, is saying something like, the man who denounced Catiline, and thus has picked out a certain man uniquely. It is a tribute to the education of philosophers that they have held this thesis for such a long time. In fact, most people, when they think of Cicero, just think of a famous Roman orator, without any pretension to think either that there was only one famous Roman orator, or that one must know something else about Cicero to have a referent for the name. I think most of us didn't even get that far. I wouldn't have necessarily known that Cicero was a Roman orator. Maybe I knew Cicero was some Roman guy, but still the point stands. Some Roman guy doesn't pick out a unique person. Consider Richard Feynman, to whom many of us are able to refer. He is a leading contemporary theoretical physicist. Everyone here, I'm sure, can state the contents of one of Feynman's theories so as to differentiate him from Murray Gell-Mann. However, the man in the street, not possessing these abilities, may still use the name Feynman. When asked, he will say, well, he's a physicist or something. He may not think that this picks out anyone uniquely. I still think he uses the name Feynman as a name for Feynman. So this is Kripke saying, theses 2 through 4 are false. Ordinary people use names all the time, even though they don't have any idea of what description would uniquely pick out an object that the name refers to. That, I think, is the most central argument Kripke is using against this cluster theory of names. You can use a name to refer to someone, even if you know almost nothing about the person, certainly not enough to pick out the person uniquely. So let's look at some of the cases where we do have a description to pick out someone uniquely. Let's say, for example, that we know that Cicero was the man who first denounced Catiline. Well, that's good. That really picks someone out uniquely. However, there's a problem because this description contains another name, namely Catiline. We must be sure that we satisfy the conditions in such a way as to avoid violating the non-circularity condition here. In particular, we must not define Catiline as the man denounced by Cicero. If we do this, we will really not be picking out anything uniquely. We'll be simply picking out a pair of objects A and B such that A denounced B. We do not think that this was the only pair where such denunciations ever occurred, so we had better add some other conditions in order to satisfy the uniqueness condition. If we say Einstein was the man who discovered the theory of relativity, that certainly picks out someone uniquely. One can be sure, as I said, that everyone here can make a compact and independent statement of this theory and so pick out Einstein uniquely. But many people actually don't know enough about this stuff. And so when asked what the theory of relativity is, they'll just say Einstein's theory. and thus be led into the most straightforward sort of vicious circle. So thesis 2, in a straightforward way, fails to be satisfied when we say Feynman is a famous physicist without attributing anything else to Feynman. In another way, it may not be satisfied in the proper way, even when it is satisfied. If we say Einstein was the man who discovered relativity theory, that does pick someone out uniquely, but it may not pick him out in such a way as to satisfy the non-circularity condition, because the theory of relativity may in turn be picked out as Einstein's theory. So thesis 2 seems to be false. Let us go on to thesis 3. If most of the phi's suitably weighted are satisfied by a unique object y, then y is the referent of the name for the speaker. Now, since we have already established that thesis 2 is wrong, why should any of the rest work? The whole theory depended on always being able to specify unique conditions which are satisfied. But still, we can look at the other theses. The picture associated with the theory is that only by giving some unique properties can you know who someone is and thus know what the reference of your name is. Well, I won't go into the question of knowing who someone is. It's really very puzzling. I think you do know who Cicero is if you just answer that he's a famous Roman orator. Strangely enough, if you know that Einstein discovered the theory of relativity and nothing about that theory, you can both know who Einstein is, namely the discoverer of the theory of relativity, and who discovered the theory of relativity, namely Einstein, on the basis of this knowledge. This seems to be a blatant violation of some sort of non-circularity condition, but it is the way we talk. That is, if someone asks you, do you know who Einstein was? You can say, yeah, he's the physicist who discovered relativity. That's enough to be answering the person's question. It therefore would seem that a person which suggests this condition must be the wrong picture. Suppose most of the phi's are in fact satisfied by a unique object. Is that object necessarily the referent of x for A? Let's suppose someone says that Gödel is the man who proved the incompleteness of arithmetic. I'll put a link to that in the description below if you're interested in learning more about Gödel and incompleteness. And this man is suitably well educated and is even able to give an independent statement account of the incompleteness theorem. He doesn't just say, well, that's Gödel's theorem or whatever. He actually states a certain theorem which he attributes to Gödel as the discoverer. Is it the case then that if most of the phi's are satisfied by a unique object y, then y is the referent of the name x for A? Let's take a simple case. In the case of Gödel, that's practically the only thing many people have heard about him, that he discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. Does it follow that whoever discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic is the referent of Gödel? Imagine the following blatantly fictional situation. I hope Professor Gödel is not present. Gödel actually lived his later years in Princeton, died in 1972. He was very interested in philosophy, so he theoretically could have attended this lecture, but I believe he did not. Suppose that Gödel was not, in fact, the author of this theorem. A man named Schmidt, whose body was found in Vienna under mysterious circumstances many years ago, actually did the work in question. His friend Gödel somehow got hold of the manuscript, and it was therefore attributed to Gödel. On the view in question, then, when our ordinary man uses the name Gödel, he really means to refer to Schmidt, because Schmidt is the unique person satisfying the description, the man who discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. Of course, you might try changing it to the man who published the discovery of the incompleteness of arithmetic. By changing the story a little further, one can even make this formulation false. Anyway, most people might not even know whether the thing was published or got around by word of mouth. Let's stick to the man who discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. So, since the man who discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic is in fact Schmidt, in this counterfactual scenario, we, when we talk about Gödel, are in fact always referring to Schmidt. But it seems to me that we are not. We simply are not. One reply, which I will discuss later, might be, you should say instead, the man to whom the incompleteness of arithmetic is commonly attributed, or something like that. Let's see what we can do with that later. It may seem to many of you that this is a very odd example, or that a situation occurs rarely. This also is a tribute to the education of philosophers. Very often we use a name on the basis of considerable misinformation. The case of mathematics used in the fictive example is a good case in point. What do we know about Peano? What many people in this room may know about Peano is that he was the discoverer of certain axioms which characterize the sequence of natural numbers, the so-called Peano axioms. I'll put a link to this below too, in case you're interested. Probably some people can even state them. I have been told that these axioms were not first discovered by Peano, but by Dedekind. Peano was, of course, not a dishonest man. I'm told that his footnotes include a credit to Dedekind. Somehow the footnote has been ignored. So on the theory in question, the term Peano, as we use it, really refers to, now that you've heard it, you see that you were really all the time talking about Dedekind. But you were not. Such illustrations could be multiplied indefinitely. Even worse misconceptions, of course, occur to the layman. In a previous example, I supposed people to identify Einstein by reference to his work on relativity. Actually, I often used to hear that Einstein's most famous achievement was the invention of the atomic bomb. So when we refer to Einstein, we refer to the inventor of the atomic bomb. But this is not so. Columbus was the first man to realize that the Earth was round. He was also the first European to land in the Western Hemisphere. Probably none of these things are true, and therefore when people use the term Columbus, they usually refer to some Greek if they use the roundness of the Earth, or to some Norseman perhaps if they use discovery of America. But they don't. They refer to Columbus. So it does not seem that if most of the phi's are satisfied by a unique object, then y is the referent of the name. This seems simply to be false. That is, here's his footnote. The cluster of descriptions theory of meaning would make Peano discovered the axioms for number theory express a trivial truth, not a misconception, and similarly for other misconceptions about the history of science. Some who have conceded such cases to me have argued that there are other uses of the same proper names satisfying the cluster theory. For example, it is argued, if we say Gödel proved the incompleteness of arithmetic, we are of course referring to Gödel, not to Schmidt. But if we say Gödel relied on a diagonal argument in this step of the proof, don't we here perhaps refer to whoever proved the theorem? Similarly, if someone asks, what did Aristotle or Shakespeare have in mind here? Isn't he talking about the author of the passage in question, whoever he is? By analogy to Denellan's usage for descriptions, this might be called an attributed use of proper names. If this is so, then assuming the Gödel-Schmidt story, the sentence Gödel proved the incompleteness theorem is false, but Gödel used a diagonal argument in the proof is, at least in some contexts, true. And the reference of the name Gödel is ambiguous. Since some counterexamples remain, the cluster of descriptions theory would still in general be false, which was my main point in the text, but it would be applicable in a wider class of cases than I thought. I think, however, that no such ambiguity need be postulated. It is perhaps true that sometimes when someone uses the name Gödel, his main interest is in whoever proved the theorem, and perhaps in some sense he refers to him. I do not think that this case is different from the case of Smith and Jones in note 3. That's where he's describing Denellan, which I skipped earlier. If I mistake Jones for Smith, I may refer in an appropriate sense to Jones when I say that Smith is raking the leaves. Nevertheless, I do not use Smith ambiguously as a name sometimes of Smith and sometimes of Jones, but univocally as a name of Smith. Similarly, if I erroneously think that Aristotle wrote such and such passage, I may perhaps sometimes use Aristotle to refer to the actual author of the passage, even though there is no ambiguity in my use of the name. In both cases, I will withdraw my original statement and my original use of the name if apprised of the facts. Recall that in these lectures, referent is used in the technical sense of the thing named by a name, not by the person, or uniquely satisfying a description, and there should be no confusion. So this is all to say that he thinks sometimes we're mistaken about all the descriptions that we use for a name. And Thesis 3 of the cluster theory said that couldn't fail. So therefore, the cluster theory is false. Thesis 4. If the vote yields no unique object, the name does not refer. Really, this has been covered before, has been covered in my previous examples. First, the vote may not yield a unique object, as in the case of Cicero or Feynman. If all you know about Feynman is that he's a physicist, there is no unique physicist, and yet the name refers. Secondly, suppose it yields no object, that nothing satisfies most or even any substantial number of the phi's. Does that mean the name doesn't refer? No, in the same way that you may have false beliefs about a person which may actually be true of someone else, so you may have false beliefs which are true of absolutely no one, and these may constitute the totality of your beliefs. Suppose, to vary the example about Gödel, that no one had discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. Perhaps the proof simply materialized by a random scattering of atoms on a piece of paper, the man Gödel being lucky enough to have been present when this improbable event occurred. Further, suppose arithmetic is not in fact incomplete. One wouldn't really expect a random scattering of atoms to produce a correct proof. A subtle error, unknown through the decades, has still been unnoticed, or perhaps not actually unnoticed, but the friends of Gödel, yada, yada, yada. So even if the conditions are not satisfied by a unique object, the name may still refer. I gave you the case of Jonah last week. Biblical scholars, as I said, think that Jonah really existed. It isn't because they think that someone ever was swallowed by a big fish or even went to Nineveh to preach. These conditions may be true of no one whatsoever, and yet the name Jonah really has a referent. In the case above of Einstein's invention of the bomb, possibly no one really deserves to be called the inventor of the device. Thesis 5 says that the statement, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's, is a priori true for A. Notice that even in a case where 3 and 4 happen to be true, a typical speaker hardly knows a priori that they are, as required by the theory. I think that my belief about Gödel is in fact correct and that the Schmidt story is just a fantasy, but the belief hardly constitutes a priori knowledge. Okay, so he's saying, maybe occasionally there's a name that works like Theses 1 through 5 say, like the name Neptune or the name Jack the Ripper. Still, for most names, that's not how they work at all. Theses 2 through 4 may be true or may not be true. If they are true, we don't usually know them to be true a priori. Maybe in the case of Neptune or in the case of Jack the Ripper, but not in most ordinary cases. In most ordinary cases, we don't know anything that has to be true about the person that the name refers to. And so now we're going to get to Kripke's positive theory of how he thinks names do work. What is the meaning of a name? Someone, let's say a baby, is born. His parents call him by a certain name. They talk about him to their friends. Other people meet him. Through various sorts of talk, the name is spread from link to link as if by a chain. A speaker who is on the far end of this chain, who has heard about, say, Richard Feynman, maybe they named Richard Feynman, the baby Richard Feynman. A person on the far end of this chain who has heard about Richard Feynman in the marketplace or elsewhere may be referring to Richard Feynman even though he can't remember from whom he first heard of Feynman or from whom he ever heard of Feynman. He knows that Feynman is a famous physicist. A certain passage of communication reaching ultimately to the man himself does reach the speaker. He then is referring to Feynman even though he can't identify him uniquely. He doesn't know what a Feynman diagram is. He doesn't know what the Feynman theory of pair production and annihilation is. Not only that, he'd have trouble distinguishing between Gell-Mann and Feynman. So he doesn't have to know these things. But instead, a chain of communication going back to Feynman himself has been established by virtue of his membership in a community which passed the name on from link to link. Not by a ceremony that he makes in private in his study. By Feynman, I shall mean the man who did such and such and such and such. On our view, it is not how the speaker thinks he got the referent, but the actual chain of communication, which is relevant. So this is what Kripke is saying, how names actually work. There's an actual initial use of the name. The name is actually passed down a chain, and I eventually get it. And it refers to whoever the people before me in the chain referred to. I think I said the other time that philosophical theories are in danger of being false, and so I wasn't going to present an alternative theory. Have I just done so? Well, in a way, but my characterization has been far less specific than a real set of necessary and sufficient conditions for reference would be. Obviously, the name is passed on from link to link, but of course, not every sort of causal chain reaching from me to a certain man will do for me to make a reference. There may be a causal chain from our use of the term Santa Claus to a certain historical saint, but still, the children, when they use this name, by this time probably do not refer to that saint. So other conditions must be satisfied in order to make this into a really rigorous theory of reference. So that is, he's saying, maybe we use the name Santa Claus because someone in the past used the name Santa Claus, because someone in the past used the name San Nicolas, because someone in the past used the name San Nicolas to refer to some person, Saint Nicholas, in 4th century Turkey. Nevertheless, if we want to say that children are mistaken when they believe Santa Claus exists, we're not denying that Saint Nicholas existed. We're just denying that they're using the name to refer to that guy. Something he thinks went wrong in that chain of uses. So some other conditions must be satisfied in order to make this into a really rigorous theory of reference. I don't know that I'm going to do this because first, I'm sort of too lazy to at the moment. Second, rather than giving a set of necessary and sufficient conditions which will work for a term like reference, I want to present just a better picture than the picture presented by the received views. Haven't I been very unfair to the description theory? Here I've stated it very precisely, more precisely perhaps than it has been stated by any of its advocates. So then it's easy to refute. Maybe if I tried to state mine with sufficient precision in the form of 6 or 7 or 8 theses, it would also turn out that when you examine the theses one by one, they will all be false. That might even be so, but the difference is this. What I think the examples I've given show is not simply that there's some technical error here or some mistake there, but that the whole picture given by this theory of how reference works, of how reference is determined, seems to be wrong from the fundamentals. It seems to be wrong to think that we give ourselves some properties which somehow qualitatively uniquely pick out an object and determine our reference in that manner. What I am trying to present is a picture which, if more details were to be filled in, might be refined so as to give more exact conditions for reference to take place. One might never reach a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. I don't know. I'm always sympathetic to Bishop Butler's everything is what it is and not another thing, in the non-trivial sense that philosophical analyses of some concept like reference in completely different terms which make no mention of reference at all are very apt to fail. Of course, in any particular case when one is given an analysis, one has to look at it and see whether it is true or false. One can't just cite this maxim to oneself and then turn the page. But more cautiously, I want to present a better picture without giving a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for reference. Such conditions would be very complicated, but what is true is that it's in virtue of our connection with other speakers in the community, going back to the referent himself, that we refer to a certain man. There may be some cases where the description picture is true, where some man really gives a name by going into the privacy of his room and saying that the referent is to be the unique thing with certain identifying properties. Jack the Ripper was a possible example which I gave. Another was Hesperus. Yet another case which can be forced into this description is that of meeting someone and being told his name. Except for a belief in the description theory, it is in its importance in other cases, one probably wouldn't think that that was a case of giving oneself a description, i.e. the guy I'm just meeting now. But one can put it in these terms if one wishes, and if one has never heard the name in any other way. Of course, if you're introduced to a man and told that's Einstein, you've heard of him before, it may be wrong and so on to say that the description is this guy I'm meeting now. But maybe in some cases such a paradigm works, especially for the man who first gives someone or something a name. Or he points to a star and says that is to be Alpha Centauri. So he can really make himself this ceremony. By Alpha Centauri, I shall mean the star right over there with such and such coordinates. But in general, this picture fails. In general, our reference depends not just on what we think ourselves, but on other people in the community, the history of how the name reached one, and things like that. It is by following such a history that one gets to the reference. A rough statement of a theory might be the following. An initial baptism takes place. This is a term that Kripke used early on now. You might remember if you ever go back and look at that again, you'll know now what he's talking about. Here, the object may be named by ostension, by pointing at it, or the reference of the name may be fixed by description. Here's the footnote. A good example of a baptism whose reference was fixed by description was that of naming Neptune in note 33. The case of a baptism by ostension can perhaps be subsumed under the description concept also. That is, ostension, when I point at that guy there, I might mean the person who I was pointing at when I said that guy there. So that's sort of a description also. Thus, the primary applicability of the description theory is to cases of initial baptism. Descriptions are also used to fix a reference in cases of designation which are similar to naming, except that the terms introduced are not usually called names. The terms 1 meter, 100 degrees centigrade have already been given as examples, and other examples will be given later in these lectures. Two things should be emphasized concerning the case of introducing a name via description in an initial baptism. First, the description used is not synonymous with the name it introduces, but rather fixes its reference. Here we differ from the usual description theorists. Second, most cases, and that point there is, remember the one that maybe I say, I will use the name Nixon to refer to whoever happened to be president in 1970. That may fix the description, but it's not synonymous because the president in 1970 was the president in 1970, is just an analytic truth, whereas Nixon was the president in 1970 is not. The president in 1970 was the president in 1970 is necessary. Nixon was president in 1970 was not. And so maybe I can figure out that it's true just by thinking about the meanings and how I fixed the referent, but it's not necessary the way that the one with the other phrase is necessary. So the meaning of the name can't be the same as the meaning of the description. Maybe the description tells us how the referent is fixed, but the meaning is not the same as that description, even in the initial baptism. So here he says, the description used is not synonymous with the name introduces, but rather fixes its reference. Here we differ from the usual description theorists. Second, most cases of initial baptism are far from those which originally inspired the description theory. Usually a baptizer is acquainted in some sense with the object he names and is able to name it ostensibly. Now, the inspiration of the description theory lay in the fact that we can often use names of famous figures of the past who are long dead and with whom no living person is acquainted. And it is precisely these cases which, on our view, cannot be correctly explained by description theory. That is, anything I think I know about Aristotle could be false. The name Aristotle just refers to whoever you would find if you were to go back through history, figuring out where did I learn the name Aristotle? Who did I get it from? Who did that person get the name from? Who did that person get the name from? And eventually we get back to some particular person in the past. That's who I'm referring to. And we could discover that that person didn't do any of the things that I think he did. Therefore, the description theory is false, especially for those historical names. He says, when the name is passed from link to link, the receiver of the name must, I think, intend when he learns it to use it with the same reference as the man from whom he heard it. If I hear the name Napoleon and decide it would be a nice name for my pet aardvark, I do not satisfy this condition. Another footnote, I can transmit the name of the aardvark to other people. For each of those people, as for me, there will be a certain sort of causal or historical connection between my use of the name and the Emperor of the French, but not one of the required type. So not just any way of inheriting a name refers to the same person. That's where he's not going into the details. Perhaps it is some such failure to keep the reference fixed, which accounts for the divergence of present uses of Santa Claus from the alleged original use. Notice that the preceding outline hardly eliminates the notion of a reference. On the contrary, it takes the notion of intending to use the same reference as a given. There's also an appeal to an initial baptism, which is explained in terms either of fixing a reference by a description or ostension, if ostension is not to be subsumed under the other category. Footnote 44, once we realize that the description used to fix the reference of a name is not synonymous with it, then the description theory can be regarded as presupposing the notion of naming a reference. The requirement I made that the description used not itself involve the notion of reference in a circular way is something else and is crucial if the description theory is to have any value at all. The reason is that the description theorist supposes that each speaker essentially uses the description he gives in an initial act of naming to determine his reference. Clearly, if he introduces the name Cicero by the determination, by Cicero, I shall refer to the man I call Cicero, he has by this ceremony determined no reference at all. Not all description theorists thought that they were eliminating the notion of reference altogether. Perhaps some realized that some notion of ostension or primitive reference is required to back it up. Certainly Russell did. Perhaps there are other possibilities for initial baptisms. He only mentions descriptions and ostension. He doesn't say anything more. Further, the George Smith case casts some doubt as to the sufficiency of the conditions. I think that was not in the excerpts we've got here. Even if the teacher does refer to his neighbor, is it clear that he has passed on his reference to the pupils? Why shouldn't their belief be about any other man named George Smith? If he says that Newton was hit by an apple, somehow his task of transmitting a reference is easier since he has communicated a common misconception about Newton. So here's the thing Kripke is saying. These common misconceptions can, in fact, help us refer because they help us identify that we're talking about the same person as someone else if they also share this common misconception. But it's not because the person did the thing that the misconception says that the name refers. To repeat, I may not have presented a theory, but I do think that I've presented a better picture than that given by description theorists. I think the next topic I shall want to talk about is that of statements of identity. These are the ones that Fraga started with. Are these necessary or contingent? The matter has been in some dispute in recent philosophy. First, everyone agrees that descriptions can be used to make contingent identity statements. If it is true that the man who invented bifocals was the first Postmaster General of the United States, that these were one and the same, it's contingently true. That is, it might have been the case that one man invented bifocals and another was the first Postmaster General of the United States. Even if they're in fact the same person, they could have been different people. So certainly when you make identity statements using descriptions, when you say the x such that phi x and the x such that psi x are one and the same, that can be a contingent fact. But philosophers have been interested also in the question of identity statements between names. When we say Hesperus is phosphorus, or Cicero is Tully, is what we are saying necessary or contingent? Further, they've been interested in another type of identity statement, which comes from scientific theory. We identify, for example, light with electromagnetic radiation between certain limits of wavelengths, or with a stream of photons. We identify heat, the thing that we're already familiar with from temperature, with the motion of molecules. Sound, with a certain sort of wave disturbance in the air, and so on. Concerning such statements, the following thesis is commonly held. First, that these are obviously contingent identities. We've found out that light is a stream of photons, but of course it might not have been a stream of photons. Heat is, in fact, the motion of molecules. We found that out, but heat might not have been the motion of molecules. Secondly, many philosophers feel damned lucky that these examples are around. Now, why? These philosophers, whose views are expounded in a vast literature, hold to a thesis called the identity thesis with respect to some psychological concepts. They think, say, that pain just is a certain material state of the brain or of the body or what have you, say the stimulation of C fibers, it doesn't matter what. Some people have then objected, well, look, there's perhaps a correlation between pain and these states of the body, but this must just be a contingent correlation between two different things, because it was an empirical discovery that this correlation ever held. Therefore, by pain, we must mean something different from this state of the body or brain, and therefore they must be two different things. Then it said, but you see, this is wrong. Everybody knows that there can be contingent identities. First, as in the bifocals and Postmaster General case, which I've mentioned before. Second, in the case believed closer to the present paradigm of theoretical identifications, such as light and a stream of photons, or water and a certain compound of hydrogen and oxygen. These are all contingent identities. They might have been false. It's no surprise, therefore, that it can be true as a matter of contingent fact and not of any necessity, that feeling pain or seeing red is just a certain state of the human body. Such psychophysical identifications can be contingent facts, just as the other identities are contingent facts. And of course, there are widespread motivations, ideological or just not wanting to have the nomological dangler of mysterious connections not accounted for by the laws of physics, one-to-one correlations between two different kinds of things, material states and things of an entirely different kind, which lead people to want to believe this thesis. I guess the main thing I'll talk about first is identity statements between names. Anyway, Kripke, the point of this passage is, Kripke is saying, now that we've understood how names work, we can identify how identity statements between names might be necessary or contingent, a priori or a posteriori. This entire argument was about identity statements between other kinds of things like pain and C fiber firing, light and electromagnetic radiation, heat and the motion of molecules. And he says, many people want to claim that these identity statements are true but contingent. And they point to the identity statements involving descriptions to make clear how it can be that identity statements are contingent. But Kripke is going to raise problems for that argument. He's going to say, at least some identity statements, if they're true, they're necessary, whether or not they're a priori or so on. And so he's going to break this connection between a priority and necessity, and he's going to use that to break the connection between some of these arguments. And this is going to have implication for his theory of philosophy of mind. Let's suppose that we refer to the same heavenly body twice, as Hesperus and Phosphorus. We say Hesperus is that star over there someday in the evening. Phosphorus is that star over there someday in the morning. Actually, Hesperus is phosphorus. Well, are there really circumstances under which Hesperus wouldn't have been phosphorus? Supposing that Hesperus is phosphorus, let's try to describe a possible situation in which it would not have been. Well, it's easy, you might think. Someone goes by and he calls two different stars Hesperus and phosphorus. It may even be under the same conditions as prevailed when we introduced the names Hesperus and phosphorus. But are those really circumstances in which Hesperus is not phosphorus or would not have been phosphorus? It seems to me, Kripke, that they are not. Now, of course, I'm committed to saying that they are not by saying that such terms as Hesperus and phosphorus, when used as names, are rigid designators. They refer in every possible world to the planet Venus. Therefore, in that possible world too, the one where two different objects were visible on those different days when I named Hesperus and I named phosphorus, he says, in that possible world too, the planet Venus is the planet Venus, and it doesn't matter what any other person has said in this other possible world. How should we describe this situation? He can't have pointed to Venus twice, and in the one case called it Hesperus and in the other phosphorus as we did. If he did so, then Hesperus as phosphorus would have been true in that situation too. He pointed maybe neither time to the planet Venus. At least one time he didn't point to the planet Venus. Let's say when he pointed to the body he called phosphorus. Then in that case, we can certainly say the name phosphorus might not have referred to phosphorus. That is, had there been a different thing in the sky when that guy introduced the name phosphorus, he would have referred to something other than phosphorus by the name phosphorus. We can even say that in the very position when viewed in the morning that we found phosphorus, it might have been the case that phosphorus was not there, that something else was there. And in that even under certain circumstances, it would have been called phosphorus. But that still is not a case in which phosphorus was not Hesperus. There might be a possible world in which, a possible counterfactual situation in which, Hesperus and phosphorus weren't names of the things they are in fact names of. Someone, if he did determine their reference by identifying descriptions, might even have used these very same identifying descriptions that we used. But still, that's not a case in which Hesperus wasn't phosphorus. For there couldn't have been such a case, given that Hesperus is phosphorus, and these names refer rigidly. Now, this seems very strange because in advance, we are inclined to say, the answer to the question whether Hesperus is phosphorus might have turned out either way. So aren't there really two possible worlds? One in which Hesperus was phosphorus, the other in which Hesperus wasn't phosphorus, in advance of our discovering that these were the same? First, there's one sense in which things might turn out either way, in which it's clear that this doesn't imply that the way it finally turns out isn't necessary. For example, the four-color theorem in mathematics might turn out to be true and might turn out to be false. It turns out it was proven just a couple of years after this, but consider any open mathematical question. It might turn out to be true, it might turn out to be false. It might turn out either way. It still doesn't mean that the way it turns out is not necessary. The might here is purely epistemic. It merely expresses our present state of ignorance or uncertainty. But it seems that in the Hesperus-phosphorus case, something even stronger is true. The evidence I have before I know that Hesperus is phosphorus is that I see a certain star or a certain heavenly body in the evening and call it Hesperus, and in the morning and call it phosphorus. I know these things. There certainly is a possible world in which a man should have seen a certain star at a certain position in the evening and called it Hesperus, and a certain star in the morning and called it phosphorus, and should have concluded, should have found out by empirical investigation that he names two different stars or two different heavenly bodies. At least one of these stars or heavenly bodies was not phosphorus. Otherwise, it couldn't have come out that way. But that's true. And so it's true that given the evidence that someone has antecedent to his empirical investigation, he can be placed in a sense in exactly the same situation, that is in a qualitatively identical epistemic situation, and call two heavenly bodies Hesperus and phosphorus without their being identical. So in that sense, we can say that it might have turned out either way. Not that it might have turned out either way as to Hesperus as being phosphorus. Though for all we knew in advance Hesperus wasn't phosphorus, that couldn't have turned out in any other way in a sense. But being put in a situation where we have exactly the same evidence, qualitatively speaking, it could have turned out that Hesperus was not phosphorus. That is, in a counterfactual world in which Hesperus and phosphorus were not used in the way that we use them as names of this planet, but as names of some other objects, one could have had qualitatively identical evidence and concluded that Hesperus and phosphorus named two different objects. There's a more elaborate discussion at this point in the third lecture, where its relation to a certain sort of counterpart theory is also mentioned. But we, using the names as we do right now, can say in advance that if Hesperus and phosphorus are one and the same, then in no other possible world can they be different. We use Hesperus as the name of a certain body and phosphorus as the name of a certain body. We use them as names of those bodies in all possible worlds. If in fact they are the same body, then in any other possible world, we have to use them as a name of that same body, even if other people in that world would have used the names differently. And so in any other possible world, it will be true that Hesperus is phosphorus. So two things are true. First, we do not know a priori that Hesperus is phosphorus, and are in no position to find out the answer except empirically. Second, this is so because we could have had evidence qualitatively indistinguishable from the evidence we have, and determined the reference of the two names by the position of two planets in the sky, without the planets being the same. Of course, it is only a contingent truth, not true in every other possible world, that the star seen over there in the evening is the star seen over there in the morning, because there are possible worlds in which phosphorus was not visible in the morning. But that contingent truth shouldn't be identified with the statement that Hesperus is phosphorus. It could only be so identified if you thought that it was a necessary truth that Hesperus is visible over there in the evening, or that phosphorus is visible over there in the morning. But neither of those are necessary truths, even if that's the way we pick out the planet. These are the contingent marks by which we identify a certain planet and give it a name. So that is, he's saying, if Hesperus is phosphorus, that is a necessary truth, but it is a posteriori. And it is uh, uh, it is contingent that that Hesperus is visible where we saw it. However, it is a priori that Hesperus was visible where we saw it when we named it, because we knew in advance when we made that name that I'm using it for that object right there. So he's saying this theory of how names work, that there's an initial ostension or a description followed by this chain of reference and the idea that the name refers rigidly, that gives us the idea that we can have a priori truths that are contingent, we can have a posteriori truths that are necessary. And it can turn out that most of the things we think we know about a name are false. All of that goes against the theory on which names are just fixed by a simple description. And so Kripke has argued against this other theory and given people this interesting set of possibilities now that these different modalities, the a priori, the analytic, the necessary, these are now three distinct things. And he suggests that has certain implications for the theory about whether the mind and the body are identical, because he thinks these identity statements could fail to be necessary. Well, the identity statement itself, he thinks, would be necessary if true, but the empirical evidence isn't going to play into it in quite the same way that we might have thought if we had identified the metaphysical and the epistemic versions of modality.